Hi, welcome back to the channel. I'm Eugene Day. Today I want to talk about complex systems. Math-free, but what are they? How do they work? How do we study them? How do we intervene to improve them? So let's start right away with a simple definition. What is a complex system? A complex system is a network of interacting elements, things, whose overall systemic behavior cannot necessarily be predicted by reductionism, that is, by studying the parts or the connections in isolation. So, an easy example is you can't explain how an ant colony works by studying an individual ant. That's just not enough information because all of the rules about how ants interact with each other and with their environment inform how the overall colony behaves, right? And if you're looking at the wrong kind of ant, you may not understand that there are multiple kinds of ants, that they all have different jobs and different roles, different genetics, etc. Similarly, you cannot understand the water cycle by studying an H2O molecule. You cannot understand the economy by studying a dollar or a single firm or a single worker. All of these things have very complex, large-scale interactions based on the sheer volume of the number of elements that they have, along with the incredibly complex rules for how things interact with one another. I study a subset of complex systems called human interactive hybridynamic systems. Human interactive means exactly what it sounds like. Some of the elements in the system are people. Typically, not just the workers in the system, but the crucial aspect of it is that humans make real-time decisions in the system. And that is an aspect of how the system unfolds over time. Hybrid means that it will have both continuous and discrete elements. So continuous elements are things like time, things like the flow of water through a pipe, and discrete elements are things that cannot be subdivided arbitrarily small. So you can have 10 workers or you can have 11 workers, but ideally you never have 10 and a half workers. Now, you may have 10 and a half FTE, right? And there are ways that you can attempt to subdivide discrete elements, but all of those also inject their own sophistication and difficulties into the model. Dynamic means simply that things change over time. Systems are not static with regard to time. That kind of defeats the whole concept of being a system. One of the major aspects of the system's behavior is that you have to control it as time goes by. So there are lots of different ways to model these complex systems, but fundamentally, the most common way is to break them down into various elements. And the most important of these, or at least the sort of base level without which you can do anything, is the state variables. State variables are the values associated with the elements. So how many ants do you have, etc. Those state variables are then combined in various ways to form your interactions or your constraints of the system. So the amount of stuff you use in order to build a product can't be more than the amount of stuff you have. That's a constraint. And also, they are combined to form your objective functions. Not every complex system has an objective function, but if you're in a business environment and you're trying to maximize your profits, or you're trying to minimize your costs, or maximize your production, or minimize your time to delivery, then the state variables will combine to form an objective that you can use as a key performance indicator. And when we're studying these complex systems, once we have the entire system modeled in the sense of we have our state variables defined, we have our relationships between them defined, maybe we have our objective function defined, what happens then is that there is a natural space that is called our feasible region, which is essentially the set of all outcomes that it is possible for this system to produce. This feasible space then contains a lot of different levels of system performance, some of which are going to be more desirable and less desirable than others. And the act of intervening in a system is to try to move the current point in the feasible space that your system is operating at to a different point which has a better value for that key performance indicator that you're considering. The way that we intervene is by manipulating either the values of our state variables. So maybe you hire or retire workforce, maybe you buy new equipment, etc., or by relaxing or changing the way that your constraints function with your state variables. So there are policy changes, perhaps, about how long a shift can be, etc. Those things will reshape where your system is performing within its feasible region. There are also things that you can do to change the shape of your feasible region itself by relaxing constraints, by removing constraints. This could be a regulatory intervention, it could be a policy intervention, it could be a new type of worker, or it could be changing the actual output of your system, right? You could decide we are deleting this state variable from our system because our textile factory is no longer going to make plaid fabric. And so we are no longer going to be making it. We're no longer going to be selling it. That's going to change the entire feasible region that we can inhabit. And these strategies together then are evaluated with your objective function, which is your key performance indicator. And that allows you to decide what solution is better than another according to your particular metric, right? And that's really important because sometimes something that's really good according to your chosen metric may have really deleterious consequences elsewhere in your system that you decide, oh, wait, that's not actually acceptable. And this happens all the time with unintended consequences, right? And one of the fundamental natures of complex systems is that these unintended consequences can propagate across the system in ways that are impossible to predict beforehand. And so that's why simulation is so valuable, is you can test these very rapidly in a safe environment. You can see, hey, are there complex propagating waves across my system that I don't want to tolerate? And if that happens, then you can say, I'm not going to do this. We might relieve a bottleneck at one point in our hospital system, only to create a worse one elsewhere. And it is really important that we can test that prior to implementing it in the real world where real life patients might be at risk. And the last thing I want to talk today about is, what is optimality? People talk all the time about optimizing performance. They talk about it in terms of their personal health. They talk about it in terms of systems. They talk about it in terms of businesses. What does it mean for a system to be optimal? And do we actually even really want that? I would argue, for the most part, first of all, that we can't tell. And second of all, that we wouldn't want to even if we could. So systems have a couple of interesting aspects about them when it comes to optimality. So, first of all, you have to say optimal given what, right? So, what that typically means is that you are at an extreme point in your feasible solution, which maximizes your current metric of interest. So, you are arranging your system so that according to this one particular measure that you consider your objective, there is no feasible point in your system. There's no way to change your system anymore that is within your control that creates a larger value of your objective function. That's an optimal point of your system. Now, the reason, and I don't want to get too mathy here, but the reason that this is challenging in the real world is that you are by definition at this optimal point when you're in a feasible region like this, at the boundary of the feasible region. What does that mean? It means if you try to push any further, you don't just have a lot of trouble. You actually move into an infeasible state. Your system is incapable of performing in that infeasible state. Now, it's hard to understand exactly what this looks like for a lot of complex systems, but you can imagine it in traffic of, you go to gridlock. and your system stops performing. In the case of a complex system like an airplane, the airplane may go unstable and crash. So operating at a true optimal point from a mathematical perspective is often really undesirable because these systems are what we call brittle. Changes on the boundary of the feasible region are dangerous. They can cause system collapse. So I typically argue that we don't really want an optimal solution if we're using that word in its true mathematical definition. What we want is a feasible point, which is near our optimal boundary, near the optimal point, but still within the feasible region and not on the boundary of the feasible region, which is a brittle, dangerous place to be. Additionally, hybrid dynamic systems, that is, systems with discrete elements, when you are at an optimal point in a hybrid system, if your feasible region changes, or if your constraints change, your optimization function changes, the new optimal point may not be anywhere near your old point, and the system can drastically, suddenly shift in really alarming ways. And that's because you cannot have smooth, continuous flow around a single point within your feasible region. And so that's very dangerous as well. Even if your system doesn't collapse, if it doesn't become infeasible, the new settling point for how everything has to behave can be very, very dramatically different from how it was behaving just a moment ago when you have a significant change. So imagine a couple of your workers don't show up. All of a sudden, everything changes according to that. And so it is much, much safer to not be near an optimal point, but to be near a very good point in your feasible region. Luckily, of course, these systems are so complex that identifying an actual optimal point is basically impossible. So I hope you have enjoyed your primer on complex systems today. I know I can talk about this forever, but I'm going to kind of try to cut it short here around 10 minutes. And YouTube thinks you're going to like this video right here. I would love it if you would like and subscribe, and I would love it if you would tell me about the complex systems in your life that you're trying to manage, because it is really challenging.